In the Aristotelian model, there are 3 structures of government. There are 6 types based on whether they are good or bad. The rule of the one, the rule of some, the rule of all. The monarchy, which is a good form of government where one person acts on behalf of the common good, translates into tyranny, which is the absolute rule of one that only looks out for their own interests. The rule of some, the aristocracy, also, when ruling only in its own interest, becomes an oligarchy. The rule of all, which is democracy, when acting on behalf of all, when corrupted by self-interest, becomes anarchy. So the 3 structures of government are properly identified by Aristotelian thought as having different types based on whether they are good or ill, whether they're disinterested in the common good or interested only in their own particular good. This is an interesting way to break it down and look at it, and it drives home that Aristotle is one of the founders of civilization and real, authentic political science, and that it's thought in human history. Niccolo Machiavelli is best remembered for The Prince, which is really a shame because all the evidence of history is that he meant that tract on power politics to be tongue-in-cheek and to be a critique of the ruler that he was trying to appease. Nevertheless, the far more important bit by Machiavelli is his discourses on the books of Titus Livy. Now you have commentary by commentary by commentary, or however this works. Titus Livy was a historian in a classic ancient sense, where of course we know that certain people write history, and whether it's true or not is based a lot on their biases and how they perceive things. Titus Livy wrote about the 12 Caesars, the early rulers in the imperial period, in this transition of what we would call the transition from republic to empire, though the Romans didn't really see it that way. Machiavelli does an analysis of that historical analysis of the events which are as they are alleged to have occurred. And he arrives at a bunch of really interesting conclusions. Why the Roman Republic, especially in the imperial period, had the perfect form of government, what the perfect form of government is, why it exists in the time of Titus Livy's book, or the time period Titus Livy covers. And all of this works out for modern political science and think in real legal law-oriented, real political science. I don't mean people's wonky degree in gender studies or complete fiction. This is when people actually studied how power worked, what the essence of it was, what the nature of it was, and how to implement it for the good of the one and of the many. So because Aristotle said there are these different structures of government and all of them can be corrupted, so they can all exist in a good form. If you have the right king, then the absolute monarchy is great. You have the right aristocracy, then that's great. You have the right-minded, educated population, then democracy is great. But all of them break down when you get to particular special interests of the individual as opposed to what's also good for the neighbor, the selfish versus the collective. I'm trying to say this without sounding like a communist. It does not mean community in the communist sense, but what is good for me must be also good for my neighbor. Otherwise, it's only good for me, and it is not a consistent principle, rather a particular immediate interest. So Machiavelli says if there are these 3 structures of government and all can go wayward, then the perfect government would be the one that incorporates all 3 models. To some degree, the Roman Republic before Caesar was doing this, but they had a split chief executive with the 2 consuls. They didn't really have anything equivalent to a monarchy because, well, they had an absolute monarchy before the Republican period and had overthrown it. The Romans detested the idea of monarchy. Everything the later emperors would do. For us, that is equivalent to a royal title. This was not so. For the Romans, it comes from the phrase imperator, which is victorious general, one who can impose certain things. Everything the Caesars did had to be dressed up in the dressings of the republic, and Romans until the fall would have told you that they lived in a republic, not in a monarchy, despite the fact that it had transitioned and some of those emperors really acted that way. But ideally throughout, they had restored in the imperial period after Caesar, restored more of a singular sovereign monarchical head, but was a chief executive. The Senate continued to be the aristocracy and had its own power and influence. And so you were limited, even as the most tyrannical emperor, you were limited in what you could do to defy the Senate or to shame or embarrass the institution, because people still looked to that as what they believed the essence of the republic was. We often forget, too, that the Romans had democracy in local places, in specific restricted. So when you voted for local magistrates, there were political parties, and everybody that was a free male, anyone not a slave, every male of the Roman Republic that was at least a freedman, so few were actually citizens, depending on the time period you're looking at, and that carried different privileges. But if you were living in Gaul, in the province of Gaul, after it was fully provincialized, and you would have local elections for local magistrates, every non-slave male would go and vote. Now, this is brilliant because it means, following the Machiavellian interpretation of Titus Livy, it means you have effectively put the most democracy at the smallest point where it affects your life most directly. This is the real genius of it. What really affects your life, if you're living in Parisium, which would be Paris, in Gaul during the provincial period, who your local magistrate is, right, over your part of town, right, is going to decide things like whether they build another slurry to get more of the sewage out of town or not, whether they're going to build another aqueduct to bring more water into your neighborhood or not. Little things like, making rules against chewing gum on the sidewalk. Yeah, I know they didn't have it. It's an example that you want to be able to affect that, so you can go to the local meetings, you can complain about it, you can vote for somebody that's going to change that. But where you can't have the chaos of individual interests and don't need it as much is at the higher levels. So sort of the further up you go, the more theoretically representational it is. And this is the real genius of the Roman imperial system. So you have an emperor who works as the chief executive, but you still maintain the Senate and its bureaucracy. And the Romans, man, to their credit, they had one of the most crazy, confusing, convoluted forms of government in history. When you look at all the different offices, what they did, what a Senate tribune is versus a consular tribune versus a legionary tribune, tribunes of the people, the military rank tribune, how all these things worked out is just incredible. And yet it evolves slowly over time. And so they have all of these complex offices, and all of the workings of it are quite complicated. And yet you've got so many bases covered. You've got so many ways for the will of the people, the will of the few, the will of the business class, which you need. There are things they're going to need that others don't. All of these different strata of Roman society kind of orbit in this huge bureaucracy that, despite being complicated, I should say, isn't really huge. It's not like they don't have a quarter of their population working in this, but it's a well-oiled machine, but it's very complicated how they all relate to it. But that ends up being the genius of it. There's not a point in Rome, unless you're a slave or a convicted criminal or a prisoner of war who's going to be a slave or a gladiator, there's very few places where there's not an avenue for you to have some impact on the quality of your life, irrespective of who happens to be emperor and how bad they are at the moment or how corrupt the Senate is. This is the real genius of the Roman system. So what made me think about all this morning? We keep running into this problem in the United States where we have this constant argument over political theory. Now, in the American context, it's sort of funny. In the Roman context, I would definitely be on the side of Caesar and the Caesarian model, and the imperial model worked really, really well. As an American, I'm more of a libertarian, and this is why. Because what we don't have that we used to have, what we don't have that Rome had, was a real sense of our own identity and nationhood within the entirety of legal, cultural, political science, structural, historical, this heritage where the nation state grows out, literally, historically, out of the family, with the man as the head of the family, with the family that becomes the extended family, that becomes the clan, that becomes a city, that becomes a country, of a collection of families living together over which you have a royal family, and you have this whole system which is deeply rooted in the culture and history of a people, of a place, of a race, of a language, of a religion in various spots in the world. This is how ideally the Queen of England is a symbolic symbol of the state, though that's gone really crazy, being that she's a woman and has like zero power now. But the idea of this in the ancient world of Pharaoh and the symbolic role that he had as a high priest type figure before power gets centralized, the emperors as late as now in Japan, but even at the height of imperial glory, only had sort of theoretical power. They were symbols and figureheads of a nation and its heritage. We could have had that in America, but now that we've completely destroyed and separated and divorced ourselves from any sort of heritage and history and people, it's kind of pointless now. The best we could do now is to have the least amount of government intrusion in our lives, because there's simply not a realistic or plausible way to repair all of the damage that has been done in the current form of the republic that we have. Originally, we had the Articles of Confederation. All of the colonies became states, literally states. In every other context, everywhere else in human history, that means you're a country, by the way. So the colonies become states. They become nations which voluntarily form an alliance in North America where they are located. This is essentially like joining the United Nations. This was a loose alliance, and they could always leave. The assurances of the Constitution, despite it giving total power to the government, really, it did. It creates a federal government that can make its own money and raise its own army and then tax you. These are the instruments of tyranny: taxation, financial control, and armies. As soon as you give that to a central government, you are no longer truly free, which is exactly what happened when the southern state said, well, we're going to take our toys and go home now, because the voluntary alliance we voluntarily joined is trying to take away our volition. And guess what? They were invaded and conquered and butchered and forced back in slavery to the free republic that they had rejected and left. Free association, but you can't quit. You can join, but you're not allowed to leave, because the guy in the north with the funny hat and the weird beard decided to suspend habeas corpus, lock up all his political enemies, put the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in prison, you name it. All of these illegal machinations to do desperately anything to keep it together, even sacrificing the identity, the history, everything that you had going for you. Your freedom is gone so that we can all stay together now as an unfree people. And from that time, the bloated federal government just growing and growing and growing, trying to control every aspect of our lives and doing it badly, rather than developing a system that still allowed more authority at the local level, that has inherently stripped everything from the local levels and moved it up. If Machiavelli were here, this is what he would say is wrong. What we're doing is, because we had this separation of powers theoretically, and this was Machiavelli's idea, right? You got all three different structures of government, and they can all be good or bad. If your nation includes all three of these working in concert, these are your checks and balances in an ancient Roman and Machiavellian sense. These checks and balances then are that not all of those branches are going to be totally corrupt at the same time, right? That can happen, not as likely. So I have all three structures coexisting. Maybe this works out. America, I don't know if any of the founding fathers read the discourses on Titus Livy by Machiavelli, but they really seem to have had something like it in mind, when they did that division of powers with not the Supreme Court. That becomes a branch, really a powerful thing later when it's meant to only be functional legally. But having the presidency, the Senate, and the House, having the House elected by the population, the Senate was appointed by the states. So essentially what you had was, again, even transitioning to this Constitution from the Confederation, they still did it in a way that maintained state sovereignty in theory, because the population en masse has districts within to elect the House of Representatives, but the state governments would choose who was in the Senate. So the sovereign authority of the state government was represented, the mass of the people was represented, and you had a presidency, and the general election being what it is, nevertheless, it ends up being representative. So you have a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy all within the same structure, which is sort of the theory they were going on. But instead of this, what we're seeing now, post-Civil War especially, the complete congregation of power and authority at the central government level, stripping away the right of states to choose their senators, moving it to the population, allowing populists from the federal level to get people to vote at this complete voting on issues that they believe are always national consciousness, making a unified nation state out of something that was an alliance of free states that were sovereign within themselves. And this transition continuing means less and less to the whole other structures don't count. There is an absolute monolithic monarchy in the presidency, or the power that controls the House and Senate through these political parties, the all or nothing thing, control it at the federal level. And out in the states, it's the same political parties choosing candidates based on the same issues, having altered all the state constitutions to reflect the federal one in its entirety, and meandering forth like this. So the negation and wiping out of all of your sovereign local identity, heritage, all of those traditions and customs, to be completely consolidated in this central unwavering empire. It is taking on the form of an oligarchy cooperating with a tyranny in order to control and make sure there's no real democracy out here, but always using that word erroneously to describe the whole republic, just to continue to lie and misrepresent the nature of things. Man, I've gone on forever on this morning. These are the crazy things I think about while I'm shopping at Meijer, by the way. So the best thing we could do for the American system is decentralize it. As much as I would like to have something, well, it's hard to even pick something to compare it to today, because the Queen of England would be the closest, but because she's a woman and they've completely stripped that of any real authority at all, that doesn't work. But in theory, there should be something more like the Japanese model at the time of World War II, where there's an emperor that is a symbol of the heritage and history of the nation and its people and its identity, and a cabinet that then is selected in various forms. And I'm not going to be an expert on how they did that then, but having the shogunate translated into a cabinet form, and then having, like the Romans did, having elections at the local level. And that's where we need to have control over things in order to directly affect our lives. It would sure be great to get back to a system that was rooted in history and heritage and language and identity and family, and that sort of symbolism which alone gives it power, and get away from this literally creating the strong central tyranny that is emerging in Marxist fashion with Marxist ideology. It's all about stripping away every bit of identity, creating a world to be ruled by this tyranny that has no religion, no race, no language, no history, no heritage. History's all bad, it's evil, no traditions, no customs. That's all ism, archaeobia. We're going to get rid of that. And in the end, just as Oswald Spengler predicted, we end up with a world with absolutely no beliefs or convictions, except the angry response if anyone implies that we have any convictions, because we don't, because we only believe in the generic mass of whatever for no good reason whatsoever, in this soulless, cultureless, religionless desecration, unfit for real human beings to live in, when we have stripped life of everything that gave life meaning because we're trying to make it better. So that's the rant for this morning. So I've been making a lot of 1-minute reels, but in case you thought I wasn't going to do any more long rants, you see, you are mistaken. Here I am. Thank you for being here. Let me know what you think. What ideally would be the government for America if we could start over again with reasonable people?